Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anna Bowler, and I'm the Digital Learning Specialist with the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Welcome to our next session in the Black History Month speaker series. We are so excited to collaborate with the Faculty of Information and Media Studies to welcome Marisa Rosa Grant to Western. FIMS is a very important faculty for the staff in the EDI office, as Mars, our communications specialist, is a graduate, and so is the son of our EDI specialist, Leslie. Before we begin their introduction, I would like to make you aware of some resources available to attendees. The closed captions have been enabled. You can access the captions by hitting the CC button in your control bar. The chat function has been disabled for this event. If you have a question, please submit it in the Q&A tab in your control options, and we will review them at the end. Lastly, we would like to remind students, staff, and faculty members at Western to complete the Western Equity Census. Beginning in October of 2021, the Western Equity Census is the first ever comprehensive demographic survey for all staff, students, and faculty, which will help us to understand the demographic and of the university and enhance the support of diversity and equity of our community. The census, which is voluntary and confidential, takes less than 5 minutes to complete. It is available online through My Human Resources for employees and Student Center for students. To learn more, visit the links provided in the chat. We will begin with a land acknowledgement offered by Karen Kayembe.
We acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehouk, and Chunukton nations on lands connected with the London Township and Samba Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. With this, we respect the longstanding relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit endure in Canada, and we accept responsibility as a public institution to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service.
Thank you, Karen. Now we welcome Ebenezer Martin Yeboah from the FIMS Student Council to introduce our special guest speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ebenezer Martin Yeboah, a PhD student of the Faculty of Information and Media Studies. For my dissertation, I'm looking at the sources and skills through which young male university students in Ghana get their sexual and reproductive health information. On behalf of the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, I would like to introduce our fourth speaker as part of the Black History Month speaker series at Western University, Marisa Rosa Grant. This is their first presentation to the Western community, and today they will share with us their talk titled Reflections on Black Queerness, Joy, History, and Significance. Marisa is an event planner focused on creating spaces for Black, queer, and trans folks. If you want to make something happen, Marisa is the person to do it. They are the founder and creator of Strapped, Poor Choices, a queer wine tour, Strapped House, and many more events to come. Aside from hosting show-stopping events, Marisa is also a workshop facilitator and event consultant. Their goal is to always make spaces inclusive to queer people of color and help you do the same. Marisa's event planning has also led them to become a DJ and a drag king. They do it all. On behalf of Western University and London community, I welcome you, Marisa.
Thank you so much for that. So I'm just going to pull up my presentation really quickly and begin. So as you heard, I am Marisa Rosa Grant. Oh, are we seeing my screen? Oh, it paused. Yeah, so I'm Marisa Rosa Grant, and I'll tell you a bit more about me. So my pronouns are they and them. I'm a non-binary lesbian. My love language is food, really, really good food. I'm the oldest of two. I plan events for a living. I'm also a mother to a 7-year-old. I have an award-nominated podcast. And yep, I'm a mother and father to many. I am so excited to be here and so thankful for the opportunity to speak. As you know, it is rare that we as Black queer people get opportunities to share our history and ways that we love and grow. So I'll get into it. So this is a baby picture of me. I made this and my parents thought it was quite hilarious. And I brought this image up to kind of illustrate the idea of a baby gay. And this is something that in queer community, we talk about a bit often when someone is new into community and just exploring themselves. So I'm just trying to give you an idea of my younger self. I came out to myself at around the age of 13. And I didn't really experiment or go out to any like parties until I reached around 20. So I feel like that's when I started to really come into my queerness. Before it was just thinking that maybe I like people who aren't, who are the same sex as me. Like it was just something so new to me and I wanted to explore and get to find some sense of community. So I was going to drag shows. I was going to really popular in Toronto cruise and tangos and just tagging along my friends. And I was definitely a baby gay. And according to Urban Dictionary, a baby gay is someone who has just come out of the closet recently, between 1 to 2 years, and is the time span of when someone could be qualified as a baby gay. Baby gays usually instantly love everything that's rainbow, hence my funky outfit here, and just generally have that innocent glee of just coming out. We must protect them. And we do. I was very much that person. I was in my second year of university when I came out fully to my friends and the people close to me. And I was doing that exact same thing. I heard Pride was coming around. I painted rainbows all over my face. I wore all the colors. At the time I did the rainbow nails. I was just trying, especially, and queer people, queer women especially might understand this, is that when you are more feminine presenting, and at the time that's how I presented, a lot of people don't right away assume or acknowledge that you might be queer. And so I felt like, okay, I really have to yell and tell everyone. But I first understood my queerness as just maybe like just a small piece of me, but I wanted something more, and I knew that there's more people out there to connect with. Though I was in university and had friends that were supportive, I didn't have community until I started to go to Church Street bars and make some friends there in the gay village in Toronto. And they started to connect me to different parties. In that time too, I was especially looking to connect with more people who might share, you know, culturally with me. So I grew up in church. So naturally, I'm looking for that same kind of sense of community. I really wanted to find other Black queer folks, especially Black queer Caribbean folks, because that's what I grew up in being in church. And the way that I found Black queer community was quite interesting. I was invited to a ball, and if someone invited you to a ball, what do you imagine? Like, just looking at these pictures here, do you imagine like ball gowns, dance floor, dressing up, all those things? Like, that's what I imagined. And I was pleasantly surprised, because what I saw in media and TV around queerness really was very white, of course. I didn't see people who looked like me, but the way my friend described this ball, I thought, okay, I'm gonna have to get like a gown or something to attend this. But this was more of the reality. There's a lot of moving things happening here, so I'll give you a second to look. For people who aren't familiar, this ball is actually an underground ball, the underground ballroom scene. It's filled with high energy music. It's filled with voguing. Most of you who aren't familiar, voguing, you probably think of like Madonna's music video. There's runway walking, there's glamorous outfits, all based on themes of the balls and cheering audiences. It's the peak of Black queer excellence. And I was definitely overdressed when I attended this ball, because yeah, I completely thought it was a ball like Cinderella, you know, but it didn't change my experience at all. I was so happy to be there. And so ball culture, or drag ball culture, it is similar to describe a young African-American and Latin American underground LGBTQ subculture that originated in New York City. So it's just a beautiful community hub where people kind of have battles based around themes, and there's performances, there's posing, there's lip singing, there's modeling. It's the space where people can, especially as queer people, where they can just have that moment to express themselves in many different ways. It's an especially like safe space for trans people to explore their gender identity. So like I was saying, for myself and many others, we saw on TV, the representation was just very white. And a lot of times it was also very male dominated, is what I noticed. My first experience with queerness on television was when I was in university and Orange is the New Black came out. So in not seeing this in the wild, I guess, my ideas and perceptions of queerness were so far behind. I wasn't getting to see what it really looks like, or even if I could picture myself in that. And had I have had the experience of going to a ball, or had I not had that experience of going to a ball, I wouldn't have been able to connect and make friends with community in the way that would then help me find myself. It's hard to see yourself in places where there's no representation. It's also really sad that in media, it was so very common for queer characters to die, and to die really tragically. It's very isolating to not see yourself represented anywhere in media. And it's only in more recent years that you start to see more of a shift to have BIPOC characters. So that's Black, Indigenous, people of color, but there's still a large white majority. So along that same note, this is what I plan to discuss with you all today. I want to share my reflections on joy, the history and significance. Joy coming from what Black joy is and why it's so important to our community. History in the sense that Black queer history and the people who play a key role in our liberation. The significance and how Black queer liberation is the framework of many things today. So moving forward with joy. What is Black joy and why is it important to our community? Wow. I don't know about anyone else, but before speaking on joy, I think it's important to note that the importance of this to Black queer community. There's just so many deaths, and especially deaths with Black trans folks in the past few years that were constantly shown Black trauma. It's in the news, it's on Twitter, it's on Instagram, it's on TikTok. And I know that I can't be alone in feeling exhausted by constantly being fed stories of our pain. That's why for us, especially as Black queer people, shifting the focus from our sorrow to our Black joy gives us more hope. As you see, there's been so many headlines of Black trans women especially being killed. There was a day when there was nine different people killed. So it definitely does something to us as Black queer people, our mental health, when we are not only just isolated because of the pandemic, but isolated in the sense that our identity is almost made to feel like we are disposable. So Black queer joy is revolutionary. It uplifts us, it loves on us, it makes us feel safe. It's community driven, it's accepting, it's nourishing, it holds us when we fall apart. There's a quote here that says, "It's traumatizing to see that another Black trans woman was killed. So we need spaces where we can see joy." And this Black queer joy is what I would see in the ballroom scene. I would see people so excited to perform and so excited to be someone else and to create this image and dance and be celebrated in a way that felt safe and amongst other people who love and think like them. Black queer joy truly is revolutionary. And it's a big part of what continues to inspire me. Black queer joy, and even more specifically the ballroom, is what inspired me to start my party series called Strapped. So my party Strapped was a monthly party here in Toronto, and it started back in August of 2019. It came to exist after the last lesbian bar had closed. And when I was coming to terms with my identity, I missed out on that last lesbian bar, and I wanted to find space and community. As I said before, I was looking all over, and anyone who's familiar with Toronto's Church Street and the Gay Village knows that a lot of these spaces are male-centric and are filled with white men. So I'm not a white man, clearly. So I stick out like a sore thumb in those spaces. I wanted to see spaces where there's BIPOC queer women, Black queer women. I wanted a space like that, but I wasn't able to find one. So I tried holding workshops and invited every queer collective, especially like queer women collective, party collectives that were making events in the city, I tried to round them all up and be like, hey, let's talk about these disappearing spaces for women and also talk about how we can make more spaces. I was hoping that after that conversation happened, that maybe it would inspire something. And I just didn't see any new changes or growth. And it could be because of a multiple of things, like not having spaces, venues thinking that women don't buy drinks, so then they don't want to let us use their venue. I took it upon myself to reach out to a venue and I said, hey, do you have space for me to hold my event here? I'm going to try and like round some queer women up and throw this party. They were thankfully just like someone canceled or something at the venue. And I said, okay, let me scoop up this opportunity. In 2 weeks, that's the amount of time I had to create this party, promote it, and sell tickets. I was able to sell tickets to the event and people showed up at the door and I think we had about 200 people that night, all on the dance floor. And it was predominantly women, predominantly Black queer women. And it was amazing. I've never seen a space like that. I had so many moments where I just had to take a step back and just breathe and see the space that I was able to make. I thought, okay, I did that, you know, like made the party happen. I had 3 Black queer women DJs. I had a stripper because the venue had a stripper pole, so I made use of it. And people wanted more. So then I was like, oh, okay, now me, a person who wasn't making parties, before this, my only experience with making parties was like house parties. So I was like, wow, okay, so the people want more. I'm gonna have to like figure it out. And I've been just going at it ever since. Each month I kept with a different theme, the first theme for the party, because I always want to create spaces that made queer women feel safe, accepted, and sexy. So I kept with different themes that kept that idea in mind. We did, the first party was leather and lingerie. The party after that one was because Lil Nas X's song Old Town Road was really big. So we did Old Town Ho and it was like a Western theme, kind of like outfits, and people wore like cow print and things like that. So it was just each month I wanted to deliver a safe space for BIPOC queer women and non-binary folks. And that was just inspired by that Black joy that I felt when I was in that ballroom scene. It just always made me feel really happy to know that people were leaving the party feeling sexy, feeling empowered, feeling accepted, because that's exactly what I wanted when I was just coming into the scene. Curating spaces for Black queer joy is not only fun, but it's also very healing. I would leave my events not feeling burnt out or exhausted. I felt so relieved that I was able to kind of bring my resources together to make something like this happen. And so for that reason, I'll always continue to do work like this because I want people to keep feeling that way. Black queer joy is so important to our community because it keeps giving us hope, especially at a time like this. It gives us hope. So with Black queer history, the history itself and the people who play key roles. There are tons of Black queer people who throughout the years have played pivotal roles in our liberation. And there's 2 that I reflect on a lot on the work that they've done and the work that I see that's still going on. And yeah, as I reflect, I'm so very inspired by not only their work, but the work that they've done that is kind of snowballed and inspired a lot of the work that we see happening today. So as some of you might have known or know of the Stonewall Riots back in June of 1969, there was two really great people who were very influential in the series of demonstrations that happened. And I'll go into a bit more of that like specific history, but first, Marsha P. Johnson, as some of you know, the first Pride ever was a riot. And the Stonewall Riots were a series of demonstrations and marches by the members of the gay community. And this was in response to the police raids. So these police raids of the Stonewall Inn, which was known as a gay bar, and in this context, gay bar, they mean specifically for gay men. And what would happen at these raids were police would line up all of the attendees and check their ID and have the female police officers take customers that were dressed as women to the bathroom to verify their sex. So if you think about that and how problematic that is, even if that was to happen today, to take each of these customers dressed as women to the bathroom to verify their sex, then any people appearing to be physically male and dressed as women would be arrested. So Marsha P. Johnson, she played a very large role in all of this as a self-proclaimed drag queen. And at the time, because the term transgender came much after her death, she identified as a transvestite. And that's not a word that we use anymore, but that is what she referred to herself as. So her role in all of this was that she almost began the riot against police. She was credited, and there's a lot of like back and forth on the details of it, but for throwing the first brick through a police car's window, which then led to the beginning of the fight for equal rights. This also was the same time that Stormé, and I am terrible at French, so I am not even going to pretend I can properly say her last name, but she was another big role in the riots that led to our liberation, especially for the reasons why we celebrate Pride now. But during these riots, Stormé ended up in a scuffle with the police, shouting at them, fighting them until they handcuffed her and threw her into a wagon, into the back of their wagon. And she was quoted saying, "Why don't you guys do something?" And this was outside with the crowd. And moments later, that crowd then turned into a mob. She's also quoted many years later as saying that it was a rebellion and it was an uprising. It was civil rights disobedience. It was not a damn riot. So these two people were instrumental in this riot that then led to there being more attention around what equal rights looks like and where we are right now. The original Pride, or what we call parade, was a riot in the streets fighting the police. And it's interesting how how this played out in a way where history is almost repeating itself. Oops, no, I went too far ahead. History is almost repeating itself because the riots and protests that we've seen over the time that we've been in this pandemic, like the June 2020 protest, were once again led by Black queer people. It's even now more prevalent that we can see how the focus has shifted, and it's now more inclusive of like going back to the roots of like Pride started out as a riot. So now with that same breath, there's these riots being started by Black queer people. And what makes that significant is what I'm going to talk about here next. Black queer liberation is the framework of many things today. So with that, the riots and the protesting that was happening back in 2020 and onwards, it's just so interesting how much work that Black queer people have done to then liberate Black folks in as a whole, Black folks, and then onwards to people of color as well. When I talk about Black queer liberation being the framework of so many things that we have here, I'm talking about it's the reason that we celebrate Pride Month. If it wasn't for those brave Black queer souls and all the people fighting for the liberation, we wouldn't be able to have all of these like big pride parades all around the city, all around the world, actually. Because of Black queer people and the liberation movements, there's more attention towards decriminalization of sex workers through civil rights movements, and many of these Black liberation movements overlapped within gay rights movements. So Marsha P. Johnson was also a sex worker. When she was on the line fighting for rights, she wasn't just fighting for one thing, she was fighting for all of her rights to also exist. A lot of things in terms of like family structures, Black queer people, especially out of necessity, carve out and create safe spaces where they can live freely and live their truth through community and through the chosen family that they then choose to create. I think it's really interesting how much of that framework then translates to the way that we, especially now, I think we kind of go back and create our own families if we've been displaced or if we've felt isolated, or you've come to Canada, for instance, and have left your family behind. That same framework comes from Black queer people, as we have been doing this for years to create space for ourselves, to create chosen family, create community. Another one that I think and reflect on a lot is how much fashion is influenced by Black queer culture. Think about streetwear, and right now it seems very popular, this like movement of gender non-conforming culture, androgynous culture. This comes from Black trans youth and the ballroom scene. A lot of people are really into Telfar bags right now, which are very beautiful bags, but a lot of people don't know that the person who created that is a Black queer man. The body positivity movement even, it went on to be a product of the fat liberation movement of the 1960s, and it was created by fat Black queer women and femmes, a space by and for marginalized bodies, for anyone who felt cast aside compared to the strict beauty standards of any time period. And this also goes back again to the ballroom scene. They created space for people to be anything they want and any way they want to present themselves. They usually have a category called body, and I think it's my favorite category because it's so heavily focused on body positivity. It's a category where a lot of like women who are thicker, women who are fat, then have this time to just like walk and really show off their body and model, which is so different from what you'd see on a runway for like Fashion Week. Black queer people are the blueprint for so many movements, and it's what has shifted the world, and it's shifted history and the way that we think and see a lot of things now. When I think about all of this as a whole, and I think about Black history, I think about Black queer history and reflect on how much work we've done. But especially now more than ever, I feel like there's so much that allies now can do. Now that we've done the work, we've made all the fashion, we've created all these blueprints, I think that we have some requests. So I've created these 5 different things that you can do to be a really great ally to Black queer folks, especially, but not even just during Black History Month, but in getting to know Black queer people and making space for Black queer people. I think it's really important to have these things on hand. So the first thing is listen to us. The first step as an ally is to listen to and believe us when we tell you what we've experienced. Too many times our experiences get kind of like just thrown under the carpet. Like we don't get to experience pain. We don't get to express our hardships because we fear that people won't believe us or take us seriously. So as an ally, listen to us. Take that time to just listen to our stories, because you might learn something new and really have a different perspective that you might not have seen on TV, because TV is not showing our stories, our true stories. So another thing is Google. Google is your friend, especially Black History Month. You should not and do not ask Black folks something that you can learn yourself. Google is very accessible and it's free. We shouldn't have to, as Black folks, endure extra labor to help you understand us. Another thing is, don't hide that privilege. I think a lot of people get kind of worked up when the idea of privilege comes up, but let your privilege show and use it right. Privilege is something that we all carry in a variety of ways, but it simply means that you haven't been discriminated against due to part of your identity. So it's not about like, oh, I worked hard to get this kind of thing. It's things that you woke up and don't experience discrimination because of that part of your identity. So with knowing that, use that to amplify the voices of others. For example, a privilege of mine is that I'm able to be out and able to express myself. I have a family that's supportive of my identity and the identities that I carry, and I can be boldly gay. So now I use that to then keep myself visible to create spaces. And in that same way, like there's so many ways that you can use your privilege to amplify voices, by like securing venues for someone else, giving them access to your space. You have a cottage. Why not lend it to your friend who is Black and doesn't have that privilege of having an empty home that just kind of sits there and that you can just vacation at the time. So it's things like this to really think about. Another thing is ongoing. You should constantly try to support Black-owned businesses. Many Black businesses have less access to funding and resources. So help begin to bridge that gap by supporting and showcasing them. If you are online looking for anything, there has to be an Etsy shop somewhere that might have that same thing and is owned by a Black company. So try that out when you're looking up anything online. I think also, like, use every opportunity that you have to showcase Black queer people, whether it be on your social media, like if you have a large following, use that as an opportunity to highlight your friends. Too often in media, we aren't given opportunities to share our stories. So hire Black talent, let them speak for themselves, because media will create narratives of Black stories, but they aren't truly by us. And so these are just a couple of things that I think can help in folks who are listening to this, watching this, in ways that you can be a better ally and just grow with us and help protect us, essentially. So with all of that, I just want to say the joy, the brilliance, the bravery, the things I've been reflecting on, and just the resilience of Black queer people is truly Black history. And our continued joy and freedom is a call for celebration. And I thank you for all making the time to listen today, and applaud you for making that time to hold space to listen to Black queer stories. I'm Marisa Rosa Grant, and you can connect with me in all these ways. Take a screen cap. It has been my pleasure to speak here. And I thank Western so much for making that time for me. I see there's questions in the Q&A box. Do I go ahead and click this? I've never used this before.
Thank you, Marisa. Thank you so much for your engaging presentation. And I just want to say that I'm amazed by this work that you do to create safe spaces for Black queer joy. We have a few questions. So I will read the first one. It says, as an educator, I'm interested in figuring out how to make relevant the party scene as a way to show and celebrate that Black queer joy of which you speak. I wonder how else we can understand the role of parties for celebration. How does this translate to other areas of life? How pivotal is this kind of empowerment? And how does it translate to recognizing a full life for Black queer women, BIPOC queer people, and trans and gender diverse people?
So I think it's not only that it's the party scene, but it's just any type of gathering. And it seems to be like the party scene seems to be a lot of people's first experiences with Black queer expression. And it's just the ballroom scene in particular is an example that I use because it's different than going to a party space where you're dancing or not. It's more of a celebration or an event that you would attend. But any type of gathering, any type of space where Black queer people, especially predominantly Black queer people, can gather and be free and have a space to feel safe is pivotal to the empowerment. Because it's similar to the riots where they gathered and fought for their rights. And it's just a way of recognizing how much their lives need to be celebrated, even more so now than ever, how much we need to be celebrated. We need to have safe spaces to celebrate, and we need visibility. We need to be seen. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Marisa. I have a few questions as well, so I'm going to switch from one that's mine and then the other one that we have in the Q&A box. So what advice do you have for members of the Black queer community who would like to start a new business?
I think for folks who are trying to start a new business, definitely look into your resources. If you have people who are doing similar things, if there's other like Black folks that you can connect with and partner with to help not only uplift their voice, but then also elevate the new business that you're creating. I think there's a lot of strength in numbers and in confiding in community. When you're starting any kind of new business, and I've done quite a few, like when I was like much younger, I wanted to find so many different ways to make money and also like have a business that's sustainable. And it's really good to just take the time to do a lot of research. Do research on who your target audience is. If you're trying to specifically reach Black queer community or queer community or just Black community as a whole, really do your research on what their needs are and the accessibility of what you might be selling in terms of like products and whatnot. Yeah, because having things, like making sure that you're creating something that there's a need for is important, as in the same way that you want to have people to really support what you're doing. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Other question is, how do you respond when those with privilege who say that in making space for those from marginalized communities, they themselves are now being marginalized?
How do you respond to that? It's interesting because it almost is worth no response, you know, because it's coming from a place of ignorance. It's a choice to not see the difference in true marginalization. People like to, like, for myself, as an example, in the spaces that I create, I'm trying to intentionally work to create spaces that queer people of color feel safe in. And a lot of the time in making those spaces and explicitly saying this, a lot of white attendees will express that they're frustrated or feel like, wow, why can't I be part of this space? And it just comes from a place of privilege. They know that they can go into any space and have access, whereas now when they feel excluded and don't feel like they can be included, then they're upset. And it's just like, this is exactly what we experience all the time as actually marginalized people. So it's dependent on you if you want to have that back and forth, but it's hard to argue with someone who just straight up doesn't want to see and understand your perspective. A lot of people now more than ever should be quite understanding and know that the difference in privileges and access to spaces. So I no longer hold space to have that fight with folks. I just make the spaces that I create for the people that need the spaces and leave it at that. I personally don't have the energy anymore to have a continued fight on who deserves space, who deserves this and that. And it just isn't for me anymore.
Thank you. As I was reading about you in your website, Marisa, one of the things that I read was that you have a Jamaican background.
Yeah.
And I found that really interesting. That stayed with me because my mother is from Trinidad. So this is the reason why I bring up this question. Would you say that your Jamaican background has had an impact on your work? And if so, how?
In some ways, yes. Like culturally, there's been a lot of like violence against queer people in Jamaica. So knowing that and knowing that that's something that a lot of my friends might have experienced while living there, it's scary because it's like that's into like, though I was not born there, that is my like family. That's where a lot of my culture, and especially in Toronto, that's where a lot of that culture comes from. But then it also makes me think like, how do we kind of switch around the narrative of like a culture that has come to be so homophobic and stuff? How do we change that narrative and create spaces for people who have come from places like this? It's changed my work in the sense that I have a better way of understanding, because now I come from a culture that there isn't celebrations like Pride. We can't have festivals like this. So I know now, like I, more than ever, I'm in a position to create these spaces, create safe spaces where people can listen to that same music that they would back home in Jamaica, listen to that dance hall, but be in a safe space to do it. So that is how it has changed my work, and just a different kind of understanding, because it fits really close to home.
Okay, and then we have one more question.
Mm-hmm.
Have people shared with you the impact of the Black Queer Joy that they find in the events that you plan?
Yeah, I've had many times where I just before the pandemic in February of 2020, I created a space called Afro Queerism, which was a Black queer open mic, and seeing the impact there of having a space where the crowd was filled with Black queer folks and their people and friends that supported the attendees and performers. Seeing the impact there and like the joy there, and just the feedback that I get, that people feel so like they feel so safe in the space and they feel so heard and seen. I've had so many times where I've been on the dance floor at one of my events and people just come up to me and like express their joy and like how happy spaces like this make them. There's been so many like emotional, like teary moments, especially coming, not that we ever really came out of the pandemic yet, but having those moments where we're actually outside and able to share space again. Just having those moments with community in person and hearing their feedback brings me even more joy, because I know that I'm not just doing it and it's falling on broken, I don't remember the phrase, but it's happening and it's making people happy, and that just brings me more and more joy, and it keeps me going for sure.
I believe you, right? Because it's kind of like contagious when you are in those spaces where you feel like that energy.
Absolutely.
We have one more question that came in.
Mm-hmm.
How the universities and those who work in universities support the Black and other queer communities, for example, in curriculum, in their spaces? What do you think about it?
I think having, like, I know when I was in university, there was a small group, kind of reminded me of like in high school, how they have GSAs. My high school didn't have this. It was basically just like a group where people of color, especially queer people of color, could just meet and socialize and just have a break from like their usual schoolwork, and just have people to kind of talk to and just express themselves. So if universities can have these clubs in addition to many other clubs that they have, I think that would hold a lot of space for community and for people to just be able to have safety and know that there's other people who are like them on campus. I think that would also help with further discussion on how to incorporate those things into curriculum. I think, and it's not too hard to do, but in all sorts of different parts, like how I've expressed that there's a lot of Black queerness in blueprints of many things. If you do a quick search and type Black queer and then anything else beyond that, you will find tons of articles that will trace it back to Black queer folks. So I encourage professors, educators to take that time, like as you're building out your curriculum, take that extra step to see if there's like some Black queerness to attach to this, because I bet there is. And I think it would definitely diversify the curriculum as well.
Thank you so much, Marisa, for your engaging presentation. I think most probably all participants will leave with this message of joy and, just appreciating your work. I would also like to thank the Faculty of Information and Media Studies, Central Communications, and everyone involved in bringing this webinar together. And a special thank you to you, Marisa, for sharing this information and, more importantly, your joy with us today. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.